I want to talk about an inspirational moment here as we take up our offering. If I'll set the scene, it was September of 1814, and America was in the throes of the War of 1812. If you don't know what the War of 1812 is, it's basically a do-over of the American Revolution, except for one gleaming fact, and that was we were no longer British citizens. So the British Army had no decorum. It was gloves off. It was a brutal retaliation for some of the tension that had built up during the Revolutionary War. The British Army had just run into Washington and burned down the United States Capitol and the White House. I don't know if many of you know that it had burned down. If it wasn't for Jackson and Jean Lafitte in the Battle of New Orleans, we may not have the America that we have today. But in a small little Massachusetts community called Scituate, there was a lighthouse. And Simeon Bates and his 9 children ran this lighthouse that protected the whole shoreline of Massachusetts and the small village. This lighthouse was critical for the shipping and commerce of the early colonies in the United States. But the British had already been there a year before. The big warship, the La Hogue, had raided this town of Scituate. They had raided the homes, they had taken all their food, their weapons, and they threatened that if there was any retaliation, the British would come back and burn their entire town down. A year later, Simeon took his 7 sons and they went into town for supplies and left their 2 daughters, their 2 teenage daughters, Rebecca and Abigail Bates. They were just 16 and 19, soon to be 20, and they had the job of just maintaining the fuel in the lighthouse. It seemed mundane, but these 2 girls were so caught up in the moment that they continually prayed to God and said, God, how can we be involved? How can we be invested? We can't do the things that our brothers get to do. But they had an important thing to do. And one day, while Simeon Bates was gone with his sons, they heard some big mechanical noise out in the harbor, and they climbed to the top of the lighthouse. And what did they see? They saw the British warship, the Bulwark. Nearly 100 guns had turned its radius toward the town of Scituate. They saw 2 boats full of over 200 British Marines ready to invade the city again. This time the wrath, it was in the minds of the British. It wasn't like it was a year before. The girls were both frightened, but they had a choice. Should I stay or should I go? Sounds like a sermon we're going to hear today. But in that moment, they asked God, God, what do we do? They raced down to the bottom of the basement of the lighthouse, and as it was approaching dark, and all they had in that basement was a musket, a snare drum, and a fife. And they reasoned that, well, if we shot the musket at the ship would just turn its guns and would destroy our family's home and would destroy the lighthouse that was critical for Massachusetts and for commerce. They took the fife, they took the drum. Rebecca knew how to play Yankee Doodle. They learned the fife on the drum from hearing their brothers in military marching orders. And they got against the wall because they were terribly afraid in this moment and began to play that drum and that fife. And the wind, they said, began to blow from the shore out into the sea. And when the British heard that as they were getting off the ship to unload on this city, they thought that there was an army of maybe 10 brigades and a militia coming towards to attack the ship. And immediately, the British began to get back to the ship and turn and cast off before the U.S. militia, or so they thought, was about to raid this little town. On that day, Rebecca and Abigail Bates became some of the greatest heroes of the War of 1812. Young, they had no innate skills other than trusting God in that moment to do something great, to give of themselves and to stay and not go. And they saved a state. They saved, in many ways, the tide of the war. The story was told in the 18th century for the next 70 years and inspired so many people. There's little books that are made called The Army of Two. Army of 2 little young women developing, women inspired by great courage and great faith in their Creator. As I think about this moment as we give, we have choices in our own life. Should we stay? Should we plant? Or should we run? Should we go? But our heart is always to give what God has in the moment. All we might have is a fife and a drum to work with. But that's all God needs. Because God can turn it into a mighty wind and echo off a mighty building, and it can sound like an army. That's the way God works. We don't trust in horses and chariots, but we trust in our God. And today, as you're inspired, hopefully by these messages, and you're inspired to give, and we so thank you for all those who faithfully give. You think today is that I give, it may not be great nor small. It may be like these two teenage girls. It may be seemingly small and insignificant, but I will tell you, beloved, your contribution is immense. Your contribution keeps hope alive. It keeps faith in this city. It keeps thus, Every Nation City Church, rolling along preaching the gospel. And we thank you for all those that continually give. And for those that give through our push pay today, you simply can text to 77977 and just put in EN City Church and follow the prompt. And you'll be blessed when you give. You can use our secure web service, our secure website, as well as those who continually give through checks every single week. That are continually faithful to sow into the glory of God.